see. Check. Okay. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And as Dave said, yes, I work for the International Council on Clean Transportation. And we're actually a very small group, about 55 people. I'd say about 40 people full-time. So, it's this very small organization. And as Dave said, the organization did kind of blow apart Dieselgate. And there was a very interesting time where, we could get crushed by this very large company, and it was a kind of a lesson in how do you present research and make it so that people can't deny the facts. And it was step by step, very slow, and then eventually it came into the point where you could only deny things so far, and it started a little bit of investigation. We're still existing, so that's good, and we must have done it right. Even though it took about two years of work to get that done. But I'm working on electric vehicles, one of our research areas, and as Dave said, I did work at UC Davis. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with UC Davis, but the researchers there have been there for a long time, since 1992, the original ZEV mandate, where they were going to remake the refueling system back in the 90s. And then EVs petered out, and then I think it was natural gas for a while, and then it was hydrogen, then it was biofuels, then it went back to plug-in hybrids only as an entryway into BEVs. So we've kind of come full circle, but there's a lot of jaded people at UC Davis, and what goes wrong in these whole transitions, and infrastructure is one of those big things that goes wrong. And so we pay very special attention, very close attention to the customers, and so that's kind of my background, and my bent is looking at a lot of these revealed preference studies and what are people actually doing on the ground. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that challenge, and actually I'm also a veteran of the hydrogen days when I thought hydrogen was the big deal. And we kept talking about remaking the gasoline infrastructure and the hydrogen infrastructure in the image of gasoline. And how is electricity different than some of these other fuels, and how hard is it to do? And does electricity have some advantages other places don't, or other kinds of infrastructure don't have? Okay, guess there's no clicker. I'll just click. So I'll come at this from kind of the gasoline perspective. We have a very long history of gasoline infrastructure, and I'll look at a little bit of a step back in gasoline refueling infrastructure, and what are we up against? We're up against 100 years of development of gasoline, and you had all sorts of ideas. This is a curbside charger or curbside gasoline, and you could just kind of stick these things up all over the place, and you didn't have to have a big gas station. You'd have these people they would set up shop on a sidewalk, kind of like a bandit hot dog stand, and then they would sell fuel by the gallon and they would compete for convenience for people to deliver the car or the gasoline to them, and then they got a little bit more fixed, and then over time they turned into gasoline stations. Well, currently there's about 150,000 gasoline stations and maybe 8 pumps per. I don't actually know that number, but maybe 8 pumps per station. So, whatever that means in terms of the total number of outlets, and so that is good enough for all the light duty infrastructure to refuel all of our 223 million light duty vehicles. And I'm not exactly sure on these numbers, but this is an order of magnitude of what you're seeing. And so one station for every 2,000 people, or one station for every about 1,500 vehicles is what we're looking at. And it's been around for over 100 years. First gasoline station, it used to be you'd go to the hardware store and you'd get a can of gas. And this is, it's next to the kerosene. And people were very used to getting liquid fuels by the gallon, and people didn't really have all that many cars. And finally, it had to be a big enough problem where you'd have the first standalone gas station in 1905. Gas was about $7 a gallon in today's prices, and it quickly went down to around $3 a gallon. But we started with a lot more gasoline stations than we have now. So 400,000 gasoline stations, and a consolidated. You got convenience store models. This guy, he's not selling anything but gas. But now you wouldn't find a gasoline station that's not selling hot dogs or candy bars or anything like that. So it's become an integrated business model. The gas brings people in to actually make money on something else. So this is kind of what we're looking at with gasoline, and what lessons can we learn, but also the perspective that it's taken a long time and we're up against a very entrenched infrastructure. And are we going to remake this in 1 year? No, there's going to be a little bit of initial startup costs along the way. So a little bit about just comparing gasoline to electricity. You could say it a bunch of different ways, but if you look at, let's say the range of a Tesla is like 335 miles, and then you say how many gallons would that be in an average car, and how long would it take to pump those gallons? And so if you're trying to put kilowatts, which is the amount of power that can go into a car, into a gasoline equivalent, you'd say it's about, for a 3-minute fill up for 300 miles, it's about the equivalent of 2,000 kilowatts. And are you guys familiar with, well, kilowatt is a rate of power, so it's just how much you're putting in at the same time. So if you compare that gasoline rate to your standard plug, over there is a 120 volt plug, I think, unless it's an Ethernet port. But just your standard plug, you can't get more than about 1.4 kilowatts out of the plug, at least in most plugs that are existing today. So it's an order of magnitude slower. 4 miles of range per hour, but if you plug in for 10 hours, that's 40 miles of range overnight, and it's actually okay for a lot of different people. The next level is level 2, and you get about 6 to 7 kilowatts, and I just multiply these things by 3. It's a general rubric, just to, like I say, order of magnitude. There's different efficiencies in cars, but 18 to 21 miles of range per hour. So if you plug it in for 10 hours, then you could get potentially 210 miles overnight. So that's good for even something like a Tesla or something like that. You might want to go a little higher if you're talking 300-mile range cars. And then fast chargers, they're currently about 50 kilowatts. And so it's still a far cry slower than the 2,000 you're getting with your gasoline. So it's not in and out, but it's about 150 miles of range per hour. So if you had a 200-mile range car, then it would be more than an hour to charge your car. But we're moving to a new standard. The top of the standard now is around 350 kilowatts, and well, that's 1,000 miles of range per hour. So if you've got a 300-mile car, it's about 20 minutes to fill up and go on about your business for your other 300 miles. So comparing the two, are they really comparable? One is a centralized system, and then the other is a very diffuse system. Yet they still serve the same function. You're trying to go from point A to point B, the same places, and how might we grow this infrastructure? One is available at your house. Gasoline doesn't come out of the wall, but electricity does, and so we've got some advantages over gasoline. So, home infrastructure upgrades. Now this is a joint project I'm working on with some researchers at UC Davis. This is, when I left about a year ago, this was a survey that we had put out to, I think this is about 4,000 Californians who own electric cars, and we asked them, what kind of home infrastructure do you have? And we know a little bit about where they live, apartments, attached houses, detached houses, and we know a little bit about what kind of car they've got. So there's 4 kinds of cars that I've broken them into broad categories. So this is a low-range plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, high-range plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. So this would be like a plug-in Prius or a Ford Focus electric plug-in hybrid. So you've got gas and electricity. And this goes about 20 miles on electricity, switches over to gas. is about 40 to 50 miles on electricity, and it switches over to gas. These are PHEVs, which have the gas backup. A low-range BEV, which is about 100 to 150 miles of range, and a high BEV, this is, in this case, it's just a Chevrolet Bolt. So we don't have any Teslas in here because they do very, very strange things. And so again, 4 different kinds of cars by 3 different kinds of housing types. And we can see that if you just take detached houses, they have pretty good access to garages and plugs, and do they decide to upgrade? Well, it turns out that if you have a very long-range car, 65% of people upgrade to this dryer plug, and so it's kind of worth it for them to upgrade their infrastructure. But you might assume that a lot of the people who have a low-range PHEV, they have the same sort of access, but it's not as worth it because you can just plug into the wall overnight. You can get your 20 miles of range back, no problem. And so why would you upgrade to this high power level 2? But as you get more and more range in the car, it becomes more relevant to more people. So if you look across housing types, you'll notice that, well, for the high BEV, it's 65% L2 for the detached houses, but it's only about, I guess, 15% for the L2 for the apartment. So it's harder to install. People don't have access, or the landlords have to install it, and so there's a problem by housing type. So how do we fix this? Should we fix it? What's the scale of the challenge? These people obviously have more ability to do it. These people don't. They still buy cars, and that's part of the challenge. And then I guess an interesting thing is there's a very large group of people who don't plug in at all. They just drive it as a hybrid. So just because you've got an electric car doesn't mean you actually drive on electricity or use it.
Isn't that a peculiarity?
Yeah, that's a very good point. This is a California study, and I would say so you get a sticker to go in the carpool lane with the purchase of your vehicle. And so some people may buy it never intending to plug it in. That happens to a lesser degree the easier it is to actually plug in at home. So those detached houses, it's still about 8% of those people don't plug in. So, but I think that you could also think it's people who might move into a place that doesn't have a plug. People move around all the time, and they could plug in one place, and then they move to another place and they can't plug it in, or it's too much of a pain. So convenience is a huge part of what people are looking for when they plug in. You find a lot of people plugging in at home because it's easy. They don't have to fight for a space. They know exactly where they're parking. They can put everything where they like it. And you see, actually, it's fairly sticky for people if they have good access at home to actually plug in every night. And when things get hard, like in public, they stop plugging in. Unless there's a cost reason to not plug in. So home infrastructure is very important. So what's our existing infrastructure in the United States? So this is, so if you take that previous graph and you say that half the market, like 48%, or if you say 50%, let's just say 50% of people, L1 is okay, and then half of the United States already they park within 20 feet of a plug. This is the Energy Information Administration. They give the survey out and they ask people, what's your access to plugs where you park your car? Are you within 20 feet of an outlet? And this is by rental status and detached versus attached houses. So this is people who own their own home and they have a detached house. And then there's people who rent in a detached house, but they're the ones most likely to have this existing infrastructure. So I guess one point here is that there's a lot of infrastructure already in the ground. If we wanted to sell to a certain group of people, we could only sell to people who already have the infrastructure existing, and then there would be no upgrade costs for those people. But for the 24%, they may want to upgrade to L2, and you would think if they're in a detached house, it might be easier. And then there's these people who don't park within 20 feet of a space, and they're a little bit harder. So their home infrastructure, I'm not sure, maybe they park on the street, maybe they have a huge bunch of boxes in their garage and they just park on, they could move into the garage, but there's a lot of people who, they've maybe converted their garage into something else. And so access to plugs is kind of an issue. What do you do for those people who just, they don't park? Is it easy to upgrade? So we're not sure about that, the upgradability of infrastructure at home. So where do these people go if we're trying to get 100% of people access to plugs or ability to buy a plug-in vehicle? These people may indicate it could be hard for a certain segment of the population. So then it goes to maybe public charging or something of that sort. So how much progress have we made on public charging in the United States? Well, there's level 2, and it's about 70,000, and I think this is exclusive of, anyway, it's about 70,000 level 2 plugs, and then you have level 1 and level DC fast at about 10,000 outlets. And so looking really quickly at the number of cars, I think it was 830,000 cars or maybe 800,000 cars. So it's about a 1 to 10 ratio. So for every 10 electric vehicles, you have about 1 level 2 charger, either at work or in public. So that's our current ratio. And then DC fast is, I'll show you some of those ratios in a minute. Also, we're starting to see this trend. So as with gasoline starting to consolidate, you see a lot of these small mom and pop gasoline stations popping up. To get this in the very early market, we're seeing some consolidation in the number of ports per site. So in the beginning, it's one port per site. So the number of sites, number of addresses equals the number of chargers, basically in the very early in 2012. And as we get to 2017, we see about 2,000 addresses that have fast charging, but you have 7,000 ports at those 2,000 sites. And you see this is an exponential growth, and then this one is leveling off. So we're starting to already see a little bit of consolidation in the fast charger market right now, as we see with gasoline.
Can I ask you the difference?
It's the same thing, sorry. It's, and the terminology, some people call addresses stations, and then some people call stations the same thing as outlets. And so it gets confusing. But yes, I mean, when I say port, it's literally the hose, the plug. Yeah, thanks.
Don't you sometimes have two hoses?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So you could only plug in, you could only have power going to one hose or the other, and that's about 25% of stations. So that number there would go down by the number of simultaneous chargings that could go on. So yeah, that's kind of an artifact. There's two different standards for fast charging. There's CCS, which is combined charging system, and there's CHAdeMO. So there's two standards, and they say put two heads on one charger, and then you can only use one at a time. But you can also say that you can plug both of them in, and then when one is finished, then the other will start. And so there is a little bit of a benefit for having more than one port. But yeah, that's a good point. Okay, the charging ecosystem. So, where does, I talked about level 1, level 2, DC fast. What are people using? What's the proportion of use when you set people out on the road, when you have home, and all these different kinds of charging opportunities. So I put these as highlights. So this is, I'll give you some of the things I'm going to be telling you. So home charging is the most important. It's the most used. It's the most useful in terms of kilowatt hours, in terms of events. And so that's really what we should be working on first and foremost is home charging. And public charging is very useful. And work is the most important away from home charging, with other public being the probably the least important. And DC fast is a little bit of both. It actually fills in. It might be kind of outsized in its importance versus its a number of uses. So, yeah, I think I just said all that. So, and this is this is classically designed by Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI. They conceived of this as the charging pyramid. And I don't know if you guys have ever heard the three-legged stool. It's become like an eight-legged stool, and then everyone's got like, the octopus. And so this charging pyramid is not the one that they put out, but this is my version of the charging pyramid, because I think theirs was home and public, and they didn't have a DC fast category. So I'm putting DC fast at the top. But this is generally in terms of the number of kilowatt hours or events that are put out there. And I'll show you some kind of real-life examples of that. So this is an activity-based pyramid, so charging while at home, charging while at work, charging while doing other things, and then DC is kind of the catch-all category for all these kinds of chargers. So what does it look like when we, again, go back to the survey and we ask people, what did you do in the last 7 days? And so we don't have to speculate anymore. We can build our own pyramid, except that there's 4 or 5 versions of the pyramid. Well, there's 4 versions here. So if you look at events by activity, so we ask, when you're at work, do you have access to charging, and do you plug in? And so they say yes, and I'm plugging while I'm working. So 16.8% of events are done while working, 6.5% of events over all different car types. So the low PHEV, high PHEV, low BEV, and a high BEV. This is over the entire system. So this is like a system-wide snapshot of where electricity comes from and where events go. So really, it's a home story. And DC supplements everyone else. So we have, if we do it by activity, so this is kilowatt hours. So what's the average number of kilowatt hours that are done at home in these different places? And you see a slightly different story. DC fast becomes more important because each time somebody plugs into a DC fast, they get a lot more kilowatt hours. So that 3.5% becomes 5.7. Now, if we take all the different people who charge it while at work, but they charge in public while at work. So they might plug in at a garage. They might work at a Target. And so it's quote unquote a public charger for the customers, but they work at Target. So, that would be kind of in the public or publicly accessible domain, but it's still workplace charging. So you can kind of look at it like this, and this is kind of where all the kilowatt hours go. And then the number of charges is completely speculative, but the point is that all these chargers at work, they could be used twice a day. The one at home might be used once a day. And so there's more use on these public chargers. And so you might actually say they're providing double the benefit. So here's where we get a little bit about access and how do we remake the infrastructure for different housing types. We, of course, have the detached house. The classics is where most of the market is. I think it's about 80 to, it used to be about 85%. Now in the last 3 years in California, it's down to about 75% of the market is in detached houses. But if you look at that, again, it's a home story. You see it's 77% of events are at home. So it even goes higher when you look at just them. And they still use workplace, public, and DC fast. But if you notice, the people in apartments, they're the ones who are going to most use, or most likely to use public infrastructure. And that's because the charging at home is not as good. And if they want to drive on electricity, especially if they are a battery electric vehicle, they have no choice. They have to charge in public, especially if there's no option. So the worse the home charging infrastructure is, the more people have to charge in public. But the other thing I might say is that people in apartments, they might cost more to serve. And it's kind of an open question. When we're remaking our infrastructure, who pays for that? Is it the landlord? Is it the utility? Is it, who's responsible for that? It's fairly clear-cut in the case of a detached house, but it gets less clear-cut as we start moving into renters, for example. Is it the landlord's, if you rent a detached house, if you want to upgrade, is there any reason why the landlord would not just say, no, I don't want to do that? Are there rules that say, I think in some towns, people actually, there's a law that says if someone requests it, you have to upgrade, but the cost is borne by the person wanting the upgrade. So it's a compromise. So you can't prevent them from doing it, but you can't make them the landlord pay for it. So this is an idea of coverage versus capacity. So this is so I'll explain this a little bit. There's this here is a chart about fast charging. And so we have BEVs per million population, and if you see off to the right there is San Jose. They have the most BEVs per person in the United States. This is by CBSA. And we also see how many vehicles per charger are there. And so as we go out to more BEVs per million population, each fast charger supports more vehicles. It's kind of backwards, but as you go up, there are fewer chargers per person or per vehicle, and as you go down, there's more chargers. So you see a big cluster of cities down here who are just starting out, and there's actually more infrastructure per car than in more developed places. And so what this is I think, a reflection of when you're expanding your territory geographically, you're going to need to put these chargers out in many different places to be relevant enough for people. So if I were to say, if I were a market of one, I would need 5 fast chargers to run my life. But if there were 2 people, chances are one of those fast chargers will be relevant to somebody else. So as you get more people using it, you don't need to add the same number of fast chargers as a function of the number of people. So it levels out into the future where you get into this utilization phase. So these chargers have very few uses per day. Same chargers, maybe plus a few, have more uses per day. So utilization goes up. So the good news is that there's this gap, but it does get better. So, but who's responsible for having these very unused chargers in the beginning? That's is still an open question. So, what I was alluding to is this valley of death. So, in the market expansion phase, there's really not a great business case. And so, you have a lot of charging, but not that many people to use it, and you're not going to make money off the charging. Who's responsible for it? Even in the higher utilization phase, you might get a few that are starting to make money, and then in the market maturation phase, very broadly, we don't know what's going to happen. This is when I'm talking about this hasn't happened yet. So there's a bunch of different things that could change what happens in the future. So if you have home charging unavailable, you might start to follow the blue line if we make a DC fast charging strategy for multi-unit dwellings, or if more people without home charging buy, they might be depending on this. If all these options are not available, level 2 public, level 2 work, home charging, then that'll make the relative need for DC fast go up. As the range increases, you'll need fewer chargers. If you increase the speed of the chargers, you'll be able to have your throughput twice as much. So instead of 50 kilowatt chargers, you have 100 kilowatt chargers. It means you can get more miles into more vehicles faster. So you need fewer chargers overall. So there's a lot of things that we don't know, but in general, you're going to have fewer chargers per car. I think, so what's my timing? Okay, so it's 5:46. I only have 15 more minutes? Okay, well, anyway, this is a little bit, so we are the ICCT, and this is what it looks like internationally. That line that I showed you with San Jose at the end, looks a little different when you put in Norway. So not every place is going to have the same ratio. You see Norway's a little bit kind of in the middle. They've got more developed market, but they also have a lot of fast chargers. And so this is potentially the future. Maybe they're going down that curve, and this is their strategy for getting more cars out there. Or it could be a market expansion strategy. You see Beijing, where they have the same sort of market level as I guess San Francisco, but they have a lot of fast charging, like tons of fast charging. And you could say this is a response to the fact that very few people have a garage in Beijing. And so there's a lot more reliance on public charging, of which DC fast is a component. And then I put these lines for different years. So this is all 2016 data. What happened in 2017? Do we see this trend? And it's generally correct in the theory of fewer, but it's somewhat sensitive. So what does that mean for Austin? And I was asking this earlier in Dave's class, and I said, how many people live in Austin? And everyone's hand went up. And I said, no, literally, how many people? And so, so I was asking like the number of people, not, I said, everyone was very polite, raising their hand to, me calling them, and I think I called on you. You said, yes, I live in Austin. So about 1 million people live in Austin, and I think maybe if you were on the lower end, it would be 2,000 BEVs.
We actually have about
4,000, okay. So you'd be somewhere in between here. But if it were 2,000, then it would be 50 chargers per BEV, and then you need about 40 fast chargers, is kind of what this says. But there's a lot of different, Tesla kind of messes that up. Free fast charging makes people use it a lot. And so, these are just general guidelines, but it might be somewhere in between there. So if you've got double that, you might need 100, you might need 80 fast chargers. Who knows? So who's remaking the fueling infrastructure in the United States? Well, I guess, when I started at the beginning of this story, Dave mentioned that Electrify America is putting all these chargers in it. And then who here knows about Electrify America? Okay, so I'll explain a little bit about it. So Electrify America is a subsidiary of Volkswagen, and is part of the settlement for the Dieselgate scandal, which, they were caught cheating on diesel. They had to put in $2 billion of infrastructure. And so they have to spend this $2 billion in 4 cycles, and each cycle is 2.5 years. So they've put out their cycle 1 investment, and then this is a map based on their cycle 1 investment. And this is fabulous. Like, they are going to put fast chargers in the worst places in the United States because there's nobody who's going to use them out in the middle of nowhere. I would say maybe 1 or 2 events per day, and they're not going to make any money, I don't think. But I think, what is very good about it is I think this is exactly what is needed at this point in time, is we need the range confidence where people, when they buy a car, a lot of people ask, what can I go to New York? Can I go to, wherever I would like to go, wherever you are in the country, can I go there? And so when you see this map, I think it's somewhat transformative for people buying an electric car. And I think it's a great way to do your first cycle investment. But I think that the business case will be challenging in these areas that are further away from cities. So as far as something that will jumpstart the market, I think this is a very appropriate investment. And what they're doing is they're putting these stations which have about a megawatt of capacity. They're putting very fast chargers in, about 350 kilowatts, 2 of them. And then they've chosen 240 sites across the United States. And this is great. So they're working on this. And yeah, this is some of the things that are happening. So remaking the infrastructure, this will go a long way towards getting us full coverage and a very basic skeleton network. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but
Oh, what was the question?
well, they're cold states that
Yeah.
they're ignoring. I
Oh.
don't know if they're ignoring Alaska, I guess, and maybe.
Well, that's part of it. I think when I discussed it with them, they said, it's something we're looking at for cycle 2, but there's just not a lot of traffic that goes through there.
Nobody lives there.
Yeah, nobody lives there, but also so you don't have the supporting population. So if there's nobody who's starting from there, then there's nobody going through there. And I suppose maybe from Chicago to Seattle, but I'm not sure if that's a huge trip. And so
Yeah, I mean, there may be a lot of truckers.
yeah, and so for the heavy duty, I think there might be different demands for heavy duty, and I think you'll have a higher power. I would say even a megawatt, I think, is coming for heavy duty. Yeah, I think 350 kilowatts is not gonna do much for. But again, that's long haul trucking, and that may not be. I don't know. They keep talking about it. It's not my specialty. But I think the 350, I've heard them talking about a megawatt instead. So it might not. It might be a different network. So, so how much public charging do we need? And I think first, and this is more of a general question, we have to answer, what is the goal for public charging? And is the goal, so there's maybe 3 goals, and I've heard them all. Is it to encourage the sale of EVs? So if I put a charger at work and I make it free, this will spur people to buy the EV. That's a good reason to do it. Or is it to enable travel on electricity? So if you have a plug-in hybrid, you don't want them running on gas, you want them running on electricity. Or maybe it helps a battery electric vehicle to get home or something. So miles that they might not otherwise have done. And there's another reason people are starting to talk about is, are we, even if you have home charging, are we trying to shift all of our energy to cleaner sources or respond to renewable grid stress? And so these are potentially different reasons, and some of them are competing. So this is just a kind of a thought experiment, but it's an open question. Let's just say that you provide free workplace charging versus paid. Is this a success if we've not changed at all the number of electric miles, if we've just shifted where people are charging? Well, I would say this situation would probably satisfy 1 in 3. We may actually want people to charge at work to soak up solar generation or something. And the people might not have bought the car in the first place if this public charging weren't available. But we wouldn't be traveling more on electricity. So sometimes these things, that you can't satisfy all these things at the same time, and it's very difficult. And so I've kind of come out in the camp of you probably should just slightly lead the market in access to chargers and let the market figure out who's going to charge money for it, who's going to have it for free. Everyone has their different motivations, and you kind of look what's out there in the market and then try to meet and exceed it just by a little bit, because all these things are going to happen, and you can't control it that tightly. So this is a little bit kind of the same idea, but also kind of a good news story for switching people to workplace charging for clean electrons. If you look at by battery size, this is a vehicle range And so these are PHEVs here. So, the Volt is that one that's 40 miles. The Leaf and all the cars that are about 80 miles are there. And then that's the 113 miles is, this is the old RAV4. And then this is the Tesla. And we asked people, if charging were completely available at your workplace, would you plug in if it were free? And we asked them based on range. And the people at Tesla said, well, I can plug in once every 2 days, and I can store the energy. I don't need to plug in every day. But if you asked them, would you pay double the price of home, it was 2 out of 100 who said that they would do that. And so you can actually, if let's say you were trying to have a strategy of switching people to workplace, you could have a lot of electrons flow in the daytime just by pricing it right. So there's a lot of flexibility in what people will do based on price. And I always like this one times home, because there's no benefit to plugging in, or the only benefit is extra miles or range confidence or anything like that. And this may be where people just start driving other cars. 2 times home is actually more expensive than gas in a lot of cases. So this is relating to that previous graph, or that when I was looking, is this a success, and what are we doing when we have free and paid? And I think you'll have, this is about 4 times more infrastructure in the free case than the paid case. So what's the number of chargers you need? Is it 70 chargers, or is it 20? So kind of in that vein, we look at commuters with public charging. This person has level 2 at home, and he has a 230 mile range car. I don't know anyone who commutes more than 120 miles each way. These people do not need workplace charging, I can almost guarantee, if they've got level 2 at home. Yet they still use it. So it's that group. So in this survey, again, sorry, this is over a 7-day period. We asked, where did people charge based on their access for home charging. So this, if you look at, this is these 4 people, they don't have home charging. These 4 people have level 1, they're very slow, and then these 4 people have level 2 at home. And so we're saying, what's the effect of public charging usage? What's the effect of home charging on public charging usage by vehicle type, vehicle range? And again, you have these 4 different kinds of cars, 2 PHEVs, and then 2 BEVs per group. Okay. Before I went on that vignette about the cheapos over here who are just plugging in for no reason, if you look at the PHEV, the low range PHEV, that's 0.6 events per car per day. And then this is, I guess it's a little bit less, and a little bit less even as far as with level 2. So you see that the home infrastructure does have an effect on the prevalence of charging. And then this is, if you look at another interesting case here is the people who don't use home and they have a 100-mile range BEV, they use a lot of fast charging. If they have level 1, they use a little bit less, but still quite a bit. And then if they have level 2 at home, it makes the fast charging usage go down. And so there's a lot of people in here who are driving these numbers. There's a little bit of free charging going on. So I would say that this bar is a little bit higher about people switching to free. But generally, if you have a lower range vehicle, it makes your usage of fast charging go up or down. So all these things, they relate to each other. And so how much do you need? Well, there's a lot of questions that come up, I think, in this graph. And what's the marginal benefit if you take, oh, we're already at 6 o'clock. Let's skip this one. So temporal distribution, if you take solar generation, so this is the amount of solar generation in megawatt hours produced by the classic duck curve, and how many commuters can you stuff into the duck curve and shift from home to work? If people plug in as soon as they get to work, it's this distribution. If you make them wait, you can kind of stuff them in to match the solar peak. So what happens is people with bigger batteries, 20% of people can soak up 50% of the duck curve if they have a very large battery. So we have a very large potential of these people who I think are, potentially freeloaders. These people to switch a lot of they could make all this L2 go away and pretty much put it all to work, and then respond to renewable generation.
But isn't wind more at night?
That's for Texas, and that's a very good point. So yeah, and we can switch it around to whichever renewable we're talking about. And so the bigger battery, it's a very California story.
So you guys don't think you'll have options?
In California?
Yeah.
Yeah, there is a little bit of, they're kind of, the problem for California right now is siting windmills. It's not as easy as Texas, and there's a lot of solar, and that's kind of our major renewable problem. But in Texas, there's a lot of wind, and I would say this would look different for just about any location. So fast charging, I'll just go very quickly through this. We're finding that 50% of this is a session data from actual fast charging events, and we know where the people live and where they charge. So at the fast charger, how far are people away? How far are people's homes away from the fast charger that they used? So this says that 50% of all sessions are less than 6 miles away for the Nissan Leaf. And so we think about fast charging as this long distance network. It might actually be doing other things and serving other purposes. We also see that about 10% of people, they're very heavy users of fast charging and driving all these numbers. And so they, through some other research, we see that a lot of them have very poor home infrastructure, and that's driving these fast charging numbers. So it can be a very flexible resource. I won't go into that. This is more of a policy question. When you're remaking the gasoline infrastructure, you'll see a lot of demand. This is demand for fast charging. You'll see a lot of demand near where people's houses are. And then I'll tell you, around here, there's not much BEV penetration, and there's not many people. And the green means that there's lower relative usage. And so these are going to be the hardest places to have justify the business proposition. And that's why it's very good that companies like Electrify America are providing this backbone network. It's going to be a great service, but it might see very low usage. And I think I'll skip that. Let's see, we're already at 6:04. One thing I'll say is that this is this is 5 different utilities, and looking at their lowest cost to charge versus the price of gasoline. And I always like to look at the Prius Prime PHEV, gas versus electricity, as the gold standard for what you should look for in how to price electricity. And the limit to which you can price electricity as a utility should fall below this green line. And so basically, if you have $1.75 gas, you got to have 12-cent electricity minimum or maximum. You can compete against $3 a gallon gas at, I guess this is 20 cents. And so somewhere between 13 and 22 cents is about the limit of what you should charge a home as a utility. And luckily, there's a lot of utilities. They're pretty good at falling below this line. But you can see that if this is, I think, San Diego, if gas prices fall, they're not going to be competitive, and people aren't going to plug in. People are actually sensitive to this. And especially if you're in a plug-in hybrid and you got 2 hoses, do I put in gas or do I put in the other hose? It's a very straight decision. You don't have to compare to a 29 mile per gallon car or a 25 mile per gallon car. That's the average car. You're looking at what your car is and which hose do I plug in. So I think especially the plug-in hybrids, it's kind of just a cost and pricing. People are sensitive to it. And I think I'll look at that moving forward. So I think moving forward, remaking our infrastructure, going back to the original theme, I think it comes back to this, the charging pyramid. Home is the most important thing we can focus on. Do we put our money into improving home infrastructure? I'd say yes, because it's the most useful. It will get people to buy it. And public charging is good for a lot of things, but it's not the basis for a system. You start looking at costs and benefits, and this is in terms of another study that was done looking at evolution of incentives, and this is electric vehicle subsidies and electric vehicle benefits. And you could say the same thing about infrastructure. So it's going to cost money in the beginning, but those savings will accrue for ratepayers over time, and people will get benefits, externality benefits from lower pollution rates. I would say soaking up renewables for lower costs of electricity. There's a lot of benefits, but they might not happen in the beginning. So I would say that we might have to look a little bit further in the future than just tomorrow to justify some of these investments, and especially in things like fast charging. People are time and money conscious and will adjust charging within those parameters. I like to say people are lazy and cheap. And if you remember those things, then a lot of things will make sense. And so it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but people do respond to cost in time and then cost in money. Home charging should be the basis, but renters, you have to figure out what to do about renters and people in apartment, multi-unit dwellings. And for those depending on public charging, I think fast charging can provide instant access. It can be the great catch-all for just about everyone. If you can't charge it on level 2, go down the street, you fast charge. It's not the most convenient, but it will get you to the next place. And so a robust network that's fairly dense, urban, not just along highways, I think is one of the early things you can do. And then fill in with the more convenient level 2, because people don't really want to fast charge, but they might have to. Workplace charging is important for all those reasons. You can shift a lot of usage. Public charging is difficult to generalize, I would say. Integrating renewables, there's a lot of hope there, and people will respond to price. People are price conscious, money conscious. And as far as pricing, I would say keep that in mind, especially with fast charging. No one's going to switch from an apartment if they're going to pay more for their cost per mile than a Toyota Corolla. So start looking at those business cases and then kind of use that as a guide to installing and charging for infrastructure. So I think that's all I have.
So we have time for questions. So we have 2 microphones. Questions? Jake.
California got a lot of publicity when it mandated solar on new housing construction, but is there any consideration on mandating charging stations built into new house construction?
I think that's actually, that's one of the easiest things you can do is in new house construction, put at least conduit. So when you want to put in the charging station, it could be just the cost of the wire and the switch. And that is actually what's happening in all over. There's like a Cal Green Code, and that is the law for new construction is for panel space and conduit. So that's.
How long it requires it, right?
What's that?
How long it requires it now?
I think it's actually being adopted all over California, I'm pretty sure. And I don't know if it's adopted, but I know it's in the regulations. I think it's called Cal Green Code. And for example, in multi-unit dwellings, San Francisco has a law that of 100% availability for every space in a multi-unit dwelling that's going in, not to be enabled with wire, but that there's no concrete that would need to be dug up to get charging to every single space. And so that's for multi-unit dwellings, and I think that's kind of the way to go, and then they size the transformers appropriately as well.
I was just real quick. I was wondering how many internal combustion engines, cars per million people do we have right now? Is it somewhere? Is it an insane number? Like, what's that disparity between how many? Okay.
Yeah, I think you'd have to do some math, but I think it's up here. Yeah, so I think it was, so 325 million people.
Okay.
Yeah, but I don't know if that's, yeah, so this is it. Yeah.
Dr. Goodenough.
Today's technology to tomorrow's technology, and therefore figuring out what phase you need to do now and what you need to do later, because technology will change in the next 5 years drastically.
This is Dr. Goodenough, one of the fathers of the lithium-ion battery.
Okay.
Working on a new generation of battery.
Oh, this is great. So actually, when you talk about new technology, you're talking about faster charging, like better batteries.
What do you mean by fast charge? You
So-
mean 5 minutes for 150 miles, or do you mean 30 minutes for 150 miles? What do you mean by fast charge?
I
And how
think-
important is fast charge? Because most people right now are doing hybrids, right? And they want to use the home charging because that's when the electricity is the cheapest, and so on. I didn't see the cost factor as far as the time at which you do the charging
Yeah.
built into your program.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple ways. You pay for power, and so with demand charges, if you go to a 350 kilowatt charger once in a month, then that will set your cost. And so I think when the cars are ready, okay, well, two questions. One is what's fast charging? And so I say anything above like 36 kilowatts, but I hope it goes to a megawatt. And it would be nice if it went to 2 megawatts if you make maybe a solid state battery that can handle 20 C or something.
I'm also curious as to how important fast charge is
Okay, so
for the designer of the battery.
What I think when you look at the complete population of people, I think there's going to be about 30% of people who it's going to be very hard to get them a place to charge overnight. And so for those people, fast charging will be much more relevant, and it will be a competition for hydrogen. So we're looking, is hydrogen going to win? Right now, the solution for those people, maybe 30% of Americans, is hydrogen. Could it be fast charging? And so it would be very important.
So if you're a car manufacturer, you really want to think of two kinds of cars.
Yes.
One for people who only commute.
Yes.
And one where they need to charge during the day and need a fast charge.
And I would say maybe a more expensive battery, better cooling, that could be a price premium, so people could choose it. And I think that cost might be lower than an equivalent hydrogen car. And having the ability to very fast charge would be more important for some people than other people. So I think I guess I hope the charging gets faster. I hope it gets down to
You will get you a faster charge, don't worry.
Okay, so how many? Okay, that's a good. I've got you. So, what's the C rate? What C rate do you think is possible?
Well, people can plate these days dendrite-free, and they can plate not to 1,000 cycles, but to 24,000 cycles, and you can do it with a fairly low resistance, so you should have a fairly fast charge.
Okay.
Go ahead, Dennis.
Yeah, so one question. So, Dr. Nicholas, have you ever considered, when you make projections, have you ever considered what the grid limitations?
Yeah, I didn't go over that, but yes, I did look at the grid, and the answer is that it's very feasible for very high power if you're not too concerned about location. So it's not. All the power exists at the substation level. It's getting it to the actual station, and I would say about maybe 50% of places you want to be could have high power stations, and then about 50% would need upgrades.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Chris.
I think Dr. Goodenough made the question mute because my question was initially, as the charging rates increase, is the battery service life being affected by that? And So, and my other question is, are you considering other alternative fuel sources like maybe methane fuel cells for remote locations that could be throttled up and down depending on demand?
So methane fuel sources that could be like attached to the fast charger, and then, yeah, fuel cell that can, yeah, like, but ones that are next to, co-located with the fast charger. No, I haven't looked at that. And I think that would have to compete with just standard battery storage. But I think it's an interesting idea. Yeah, so you wouldn't even have to put out, wires to the place if you could drop off fuel. So I think that would be, it'd just be a cost issue. For very remote sites, that might be the right solution.
Actually, when I talk to utilities, a lot of times it isn't a big issue. There's no technological breakthrough required. It's just economics to drag the wires and put pads down on transformers. It's just economics to try to make the business case positive.
Oh, yeah.
When the electricity is a little cheaper from the grid, that these charging stations will store charge that they can then use to charge quickly. Is this factored in some way in your analysis?
No, actually, I don't look at that specifically, but I think just kind of anecdotally, I think that especially when they have a low utilization, those battery backups could drastically reduce the demand charges and those sort of things. I don't look at it specifically. No, but I think there's a lot of places that don't need it. So, yeah.
Just in sort of the gist of, you're talking about where and how the infrastructure needs to be invested, and I'm just wondering, historically, looking at the example of gasoline stations, how much subsidization or planning was done at all, and how much of the development was simply market demand being met? I know we are still definitely at the point where there's got to be some level of subsidization of these, but what role do you see for private investment coming in? Is there a price point that people need to see? Is there a number of vehicles? Are there any gas station companies that are already saying, well, we're just going to start putting these chargers in on our own because we see that there's money to be made, versus most of the argument I'm seeing now sounds much more like a city planner, state level commission deciding on where to send money.
Right.
And I'm wondering if there's even enough money at a public level to meet the charging demand, or if we're going to have private investment.
So yes, there are. I think it comes down to, if you're talking about fast charging in particular, it was interesting. So California Energy Commission had a big pot of money. I think it was like $70 million. And they had different criteria, and you just had to meet these criteria, and anyone could apply, and instantly, if they met them, you could get the subsidy for a fast charger. Like, I think it was something like a 30% cost share. I don't know the exact numbers, but it was actually about 1/3 of the applicants were gas stations. And the major gasoline companies like Shell and Chevron, I don't know if you have Texaco out here, I don't think they own their own gas stations for the most part. It's like mom and pops, and they just brand it. And so it's these individual owners who say, okay, I've got a great site, and I want to put a fast charger in. I don't know if they're experimenting or if it's going to work out, but there's significant interest by those people to try to sell fast charging.
As a matter of fact, in Europe, Shell is installing some DC fast chargers in their gas stations.
And so to your other question, like, whose responsibility is it? I think that we are trying to, with gasoline, we weren't trying to supplant the horse. Right now we're trying to go against a system that's already working. Gasoline is a very successful system, and we've got a lot of things figured out. But if we're trying to encourage this and we see light at the end of the tunnel, then there might be this valley of death in the beginning.
I've also seen some behavioral study issue stuff that basically looks at the fact that most of the folks who are adopting electric vehicles now have in the technology world we live in now, they have an early adopter mentality, where they're one, willing to deal with a certain level of inconvenience or difference in how something is used. Now, obviously, there's the argument that charging an EV from your house is actually a pretty convenient addition for quite a few people, but people move quite a bit. There's the apartment issue, and I think there's probably a reasonable argument that many people are perfectly happy to fill their car up in a public space as long as the charging time is within some percentage of however long people typically spend at a gas station. So I don't know if I know y'all handle a whole range of issue, but I don't know if there's any data on that. What is the typical amount of time that someone actually spends in a gas station, and how close is our charging capacity to that time?
It's not that close. So the fastest chargers today are about 45 minutes to get like the equivalent of a tank of gas. But that could go down to about 20 minutes. And so that's how close we are, I think, with 350. And 2,000 kilowatts versus 350 it's 5.7 times longer. There's a little bit of transaction costs, even in gasoline stations, pulling up, getting a credit card, and all that. So those costs are not going to go away. And I think it's 2 or 3 minutes on either side of the transaction for that. And so, yeah, you still spend 6 minutes at a gas station. I think that was all your questions. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much for coming all the way to Austin. Let's thank our guest.